This is actually a great time to be having this conversation about image making and political branding because, as you all know, we're having a federal election next year, and the NDP provincially has just anointed its new leader. So we'll be hearing a lot more about the leader, and then we have the municipal elections in November. So there's going to be a lot of political branding going on in this neighborhood. I'm going to do a question and answer with our panelists, and then at the end, we're going to open it up to you guys. If you have any questions, save them. And I'm going to just briefly introduce our panelists to start. Directly to my right, Mira Oreck, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Broadbent Institute. I guess then you're an NDPer.
Definitely a Social Democrat.
Okay. She has worked on campaigns in the United States and in Canada, and I understand you also played an instrumental role in the campaign of the current mayor, Gregor Robertson. Okay. Next in line is Hamish Marshall, who's an MBA and president of two companies engaged in marketing, public affairs, and branding, Abington Research and Go Nuclear Productions. Now, it says here, Hamish, that you have worked on more than 100 political and advocacy campaigns from England to the United States to Australia and right across Canada. Over 100. And he's living to tell the tale. He has also served in the PMO and was pollster for Stephen Harper's party, his winning campaign in 2008. And then we have Bob Ransford, who is a communications consultant and urban designer, and assures me that these days he's quite nonpartisan. He has been, however, a political advisor in the senior levels of government in Ottawa. I believe that was for Brian Mulroney. And in Victoria for
I worked with
Bill Vander Zalm. And Bob has worked on more than 60 election campaigns at the national, provincial, and municipal levels. So I'm going to start off by asking, I'm going to ask Hamish, what is political branding? And what is the difference between advertising a box of Smarties and Stephen Harper?
Well, political branding is the realization, it's based on the realization that the average voter doesn't spend a huge amount of time thinking about politics. Most people vote, if they vote at all, and actually only about half the people vote, so they're voting occasionally every 3 or 4 years at different levels, and they're not thinking a lot about politics. And just like they're perhaps not thinking a lot about Smarties, the goal of branding is to give them 1 or 2 ideas about the person or the party that they're voting for that gives them at least something basic to evaluate their voting decision on. And it's using a lot of the techniques from commercial branding. The big difference from commercial branding is twofold. One is that it's a decision at a certain point in time. If I'm buying Smarties, and whoever owns Smarties is advertising me, they want me to buy a pack of Smarties every time I think about going to get a chocolate bar, which might be, once every couple of weeks. My wife's here, so it's only about once every 3 months, of course, because they're competing against me going and buying a Mars bar or an Aero bar or whatever else. So they're going on an ongoing sort of basis, whereas in politics, it's all about persuading you to make that decision once on election day, and everything's building up to that, and everybody has sort of a similar decision schedule. And the other aspect of it is that unlike Smarties, you don't have other people saying bad things about your product. There's not a lot of negative advertising in the commercial world, whereas in politics, that's...
Unless you're Blue Buffalo dog food. They say really bad things about other dog foods.
Right. And how the other dog foods fight back is very interesting, and many people who have experience in the commercial branding side of things don't deal very well with that kind of attack. Whereas in politics, because it's a binary decision, Blue Buffalo... you could buy your Blue Buffalo one week, but decide to buy something else the next week and come back to Blue Buffalo, so they continue to fight for it. Politics, you're only voting once on one day, so it's about getting that decision and making sure people.
So you basically you worked for Stephen Harper. Tell us, when you worked for him, what was the brand you were peddling for Stephen Harper? What did you want people pop into your head when you think Stephen Harper?
So the brand evolves over time as circumstances change. So before he was Prime Minister, the brand was based around all challengers have a degree of change associated with them. But I would say more than anything else, it was based around the idea of accountability and doing things differently after the 2005 and earlier scandals in Quebec with the Liberal government. So that was his primary brand early on when he first became Prime Minister, and the very first acts he did as Prime Minister, the Accountability Act and a few other things, were very much based around that. The brand going into 2008 was based around getting things done, because there was a lot of promises that were made in the first campaign that were done, the GST cut being the most obvious. So that was based around getting things done, getting action, and it was again hearkening back and contrasting him with Paul Martin, who was seen as a prime minister who spent 10 years trying to become prime minister and then didn't really know what to do with it when he got there. So it evolved that way, and now it's all about the economy. Now it's Stephen Harper equals good economic management.
So going into 2015's election, we're probably going to be pummeled with jobs in the economy, Stephen Harper.
Absolutely, and it has to be about that trust, because by the time the next election comes around, Harper will be in Prime Minister for 9 3/4 years.
Right.
And it's difficult for anybody who's been in power for a decade to get reelected. So it's going to be, if they have their way, the brand will all be about the economy. Stephen Harper equals strong economy.
Okay, Mira, let's talk a bit about the social democratic end of things. How would you, if you were sitting in Tom Mulcair's office, how would you brand him for next year?
It's a good question. I would first start off by saying that I think a political brand is really a visual and literal expression of the values of a party. So what is the party trying to exude? As much as it is a slogan, I think it's actually deeper than that. It's a deeper expression of who the party is, who it represents, and who it's seeking to represent. And I think a good brand, and you see this more and more with commercial brands, a good brand goes beyond Smarties versus Mars bars. It goes into who actually made the Smarties. Is there a family behind it? There's an attempt to personalize brands and to have them be an expression of something more. You see this with Ben & Jerry's. You see it with Stonyfield's yogurt. So I think you can see that directly translated into politics as well. I actually think political brands have become too thin in the past number of years, and they sort of run on this, change something.
I'm sorry, what do you mean too thin? Give me an example.
I think they don't express values in the way that they should, and so people are running on a platform to change politics, but that's it. They're not saying what who they are, what they want to do. So if I were Tom Mulcair, I would want. I think he should run on some kind of fighting for Canada, because I think that whether that's fighting for our Canada or fighting for Canadian leadership or fighting for democracy, because I think if you have a broad overarching brand, let's say fighting for our Canada, you can, underneath that brand, that becomes an umbrella. And then underneath it, you can talk about the assault on democracy. You can talk about what's happened with environmental regulation. You can sort of create a brand that's an umbrella that states clearly what the values of the party are, and then find strands underneath it that feed into that larger set of values and overarching brand. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think that people. They're seeking for a political party to define itself through a set of values, not through we want to gain power, or we think we should be in power. It's like, well, who are you? And, do I see myself represented in the values that you're defining yourself by?
Bob?
Barbara, can I just add to that? Because
Sure.
I think what Mira is talking about in terms of defining your brand is really a protection against someone else defining you. We talked about what Stephen Harper's brand was and trying to define what his issues were, but in the last election, he defined Ignatieff right out from the very beginning as being an un-Canadian or a non-Canadian. And, he was this interloper that was coming back to Canada, and I think it was a very unfair brand. If you look at his history and his lineage in Canada, his family was very much a part of the founding of the country, going much back in our history. But I think that's what you do when you have a very broad brand that is an umbrella over a wide range of values that can identify with who your core voters are. You protect against others trying to define you.
Mm-hmm. It strikes me that Justin Trudeau is not right now doing that very well, because Harper is promoting the idea that he's inexperienced. He's just an English or a drama teacher. He doesn't have the experience to run Canada. And again, he's preempting, Harper is, and trying to do with Trudeau what he did with Ignatieff. He's creating a brand for Trudeau. Do you think this is a successful thing that he's doing?
It seems that some of the numbers are starting to show that it's successful. I think some of it is Trudeau's own stumbling around, trying to find wedge issues and defining himself. Instead of having that umbrella, he's trying to define himself on a couple of wedge issues, and it doesn't seem to be working. And he has this persona that I think he hasn't strengthened that as part of his brand yet and contrasted that with Harper. I think he has an opportunity to contrast that with Harper, because Harper's a very detached and cold person, whereas Trudeau seems to be an outgoing person, but people are wondering how deep or how superficial he is or how deep he is.
Mm-hmm. Staying with Bob, I want to ask you broadly whether it's always been important for a political candidate to have a brand. Has it always been that important?
Well, your values are your own brand in terms of all of us have values, and that brands us. So a politician identifying with the voters' values has always been a part of attracting support, and that's what leadership's all about. But I think we've moved to a much more superficial way of treating politics, just the way we treat smarties today, and a lot has to do with communications and communications technology today. A lot of it has to do how the voters are actually disengaging from civic life today, and they're cocooning basically, and they have their self-interest that today you can sit down with your Twitter feed or you can sit down with your Netflix and narrow your interests very specifically and not be able to have this sort of broad view of the world. And I think politics is responding to that. Mm-hmm. And I think dangerously so. And some politicians are starting to find ways to attract people back in, trying to find these hooks to bring them back in. And some of them are doing that in a superficial way, and I'm concerned about that as well. I call it, what we need to try and avoid is what I call drive-by voting, where it's people are voting without really thinking about what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. How crucial is advertising to the success of a politician? Can advertising actually win elections? Mira?
I would say, unfortunately, yes. I mean, good advertising can do exactly what we've just heard. Stephen Harper defining Ignatieff or defining Trudeau, or and I think to Bob's point, good advertising is actually becoming much harder to do because people are tuning into certain networks and not others, and it's not the same kind of environment where you place an ad in the Globe and Mail and you think you're going to actually sway voters. So I think advertising has significantly changed and become much more sophisticated, and political parties have to respond to that, or they're not going to. Look, on the one hand, they have a chance to reach their base much more specifically because we know how to target voters. But on the other hand, it's harder to reach people through network news, for instance. Having said that...
So you're doing it by email and Twitter feeds and...
Or ads online, But I'll give one interesting example. In the last New York City election, the current mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, his whole operation up until the election had been a field campaign, no advertisements. And they realized essentially that there was not enough of any given voter base to allow them to win the nomination, which was essentially the election, the Democratic nomination. And so they took a risk, and they ran 3 ads. They covered the entire city with 3 ads with one message, A Tale of Two Cities. And it was a risk, a total risk, because they had no idea whether or not people would identify with that language from different class, different race, different neighborhoods, different backgrounds. But they realized that a broad-based message was the only way that they were going to get the kind of support that they needed, and it worked. And it worked because they actually brought people together around a value set that was broad enough that enough people could respond to it. And those were all through ads, and they were through brilliant TV ads. But that's a risk, and I think it's uncommon.
But a simple phrase like A Tale of Two Cities can just nail it for a candidate, can't it? It's that superficial.
Well, it has to be deeper than that, though. I think probably what that campaign did is it started to raise enough awareness about de Blasio that he could start connecting in the narrow casting areas that he needed to bring people on side. Traditional advertising, as we know it, the billboards, the TV advertising, the newspaper advertising today really isn't conveying a message. It's basically creating a place to create awareness, and then you drive people to other places where you can start communicating with them. And you communicate with them individually, almost in the networks that they're involved in.
I'm not sure if I agree with that. I think that, especially your comment about being superficial, when you're in politics and you're fighting about branding a politician, whether it's you or your opponent, you're fighting over adjectives. I believe most voters have enough attention for politics that they have 1 or 2 adjectives about a politician or a party in their mind, and it's all about defining that. So when we were working for Harper and I did a lot of the work on the Stéphane Dion Not a Leader ads back in the run-up to the 2008
Boy,
election.
were those mean.
Well, I'll tell you that the way they worked for 2 reasons. One is 3 reasons. Nobody knew who Stéphane Dion was, so we had a blank slate. And this is a mistake that people who follow politics closely make all the time. They assume that politicians who've been around for a long time have a brand. When Greg Selinger, who's the Premier of Manitoba, became Premier, he had been Finance Minister uninterrupted for 10 years. So everybody in the political class in Manitoba knew exactly who Greg Selinger was. Every columnist, everybody, anybody who was remotely interested in politics. But when you actually looked at his numbers, only about 26% of Manitobans had an impression of him. Only 26% of people really had a clue who this guy was, who'd been finance minister for a decade. So Stéphane Dion, sure, he'd been a cabinet minister and a bunch of other stuff, but he'd been around for a bit, but nobody had any clue who he was. And the trick to a good brand, though, is we can't go and create advertising and a brand that isn't true. It's got to be based on something authentic. So in Dion's case, we looked at his personality and we looked at things that he'd done, and we got the feeling that he was a ditherer and somebody who couldn't make a decision. And they had this amazing quote where he'd said, "We couldn't get it done," and it's not easy to make priorities. I mean, his own language saying it, which makes it much easier. But this was true about him, and it bore itself out, and especially compared to the guy I was working for, Harper, who rightly or wrongly, whether you see him as democratic or autocratic, was certainly seen as a strong leader. So it was a very strong contrast. But if we'd gone out and put out ads that said, Stéphane Dion is a crook, he's really corrupt, nobody would have believed it, because it's not true. Stéphane Dion is a lot of things, and there's a lot of things I don't like about him, but I've never met anybody who would say he was in any way anything but honest. And so it's about choosing those adjectives. If you're going to fight over those adjectives, figure out what they are, realize you can't get a complex message. If you go and I've done this, I looked at some of the ads that are running the Ontario election right now, and you see these ads that have got 3 or 4 different messages or 3 or 4 different ideas in them. You're just throwing money at the TV networks. I mean, they're happy to take it, but it's a complete waste. You should have one very, very simple idea and just pound it again and again. And people believed Dion, and it was fascinating to watch, because we put out those ads in early February. We ran them hard. We put a large ad buy behind it. The entire commentariat, all the pundits, every politically involved said they're mean, they're awful, it's terrible, it's not going to work, backlash, blah, blah, blah. And then within 6 months, you hear people on the street saying, that Dion guy, he's not much of a leader.
But there's difference between something that's mean and awful and something that works. And lots of things that are mean and awful work. Right? And I think there is a question as to whether or not you want to be the political brand that's mean and awful to work. and what the responsibility there is on behalf of a political party to essentially disengage people because you're putting out a message that turns so many people off. And there's no doubt there's a short-term gain. The question is what you're doing to politics and to political brand and to civic engagement.
I think as we're moving more towards these adjectives that Hamish is talking about, we're moving away from issues. And issues are really what gets to the core of people's values, what they really believe in themselves. And we're saying that really doesn't matter. What really matters is how we describe what we're doing, how we describe what someone else is. Forget about what's deeper than that. And I think that is turning people off. I think that's why young people are saying, I'm not interested in playing in that game.
But if you're trying to engage people, academic type arguments about whether this or that policy is more effective is, I would argue, less effective than having a personality-driven fight between two leaders. That gets way more attention of people and may engage them to vote.
But that personality fight today isn't even covering the issues that people care about. It's meaningless to the issues that people care about.
But it may be more effective in actually getting people to vote.
Well, the voting numbers aren't going up.
Well,
That's true.
That's not strictly true, though. I mean, we've seen in 2006 turnout was higher than 2004. 2011 was higher than 2008. And what you find is that people are making a choice. And this is, I think, very, very important. There's this idea in politics, everybody should vote. It's so wonderful, everybody should vote. The fact of the matter is that a lot of people, in some cases, most people, the choice is between voting or whether this matters to me enough to bother voting. Because in many ways, we're not fighting about fundamental issues of democracy like they are in developing countries.
We are right now.
No, we're not. I mean, the perfect example is this ridiculous Fair Elections Act brouhaha. The only people who cared about the Fair Elections Act were people on Twitter and people writing columns. Average people are not interested. They didn't pay attention. It had no impact on the poll numbers. It simply is the ultimate insider issue. And it's great. It's a great fundraiser for the NDP, and it's a good way for Justin to try to distinguish himself, and that's wonderful. But it's not something that actually moves votes.
I would actually strongly,
I think Mira disagrees.
Well, no, I think that I've seen that play out differently. The voter suppression played out significantly in the last presidential election, and I think it has the potential to. Personally, from what I saw over the past few months, I would say that this is one of the issues that actually more Canadians, on a broader level, spoke about. When you hear the Globe and Mail say things like Stephen Harper put down the gun. I think there's actually some recognition that there's concern around this. And I think that as a political brand, poll numbers may not shift, and we know how accurate polling can and cannot be. But as a political brand, I think that people will start to associate Harper conservatives with a challenge on democracy.
And that will be the adjective. That will be the adjective that defines him.
Well, it's the adjective that the opposition will try to define him with. I think you hit the nail on the head, and you said the Globe and Mail's writing it. The Globe and Mail, what the Globe and Mail editorial board is so less relevant today than it was 20 or 30 years ago. It's frankly irrelevant.
I would agree with you that it's so much less relevant. I don't think it's irrelevant, and I think it may not reach your base, which is the point that you're making.
So therefore, it's not relevant to the people we're trying to communicate with.
Okay, we're going to move along, and we have a feisty panel here. Hamish, how can we use advertising to make citizens more engaged and to get them out voting? Maybe you're not the one to ask, he wants to get certain groups to stop voting.
I'm not. I don't want to. Let me be very clear. I don't want people not to vote. I just think that, in many cases, not voting is a legitimate choice for people. They're saying none of the above. I don't like the choices, or it's not important enough. Things are more or less okay. I can live with any of these guys. And there's a lot of that. And what you find is that in elections that typically, I can get really technical on this, but the big change in the 2006 campaign was that turnout went up, and if you look at it riding by riding and poll by poll, it correlates very, very, very strongly with conservative vote. And what it was is that people who had essentially sat out the previous 10 years of the divided right, saying neither of these right-wing parties will ever win, so I'm not going to bother voting. Turned out and voted, and that's one of the reasons why Harper won in 2006 due to higher turnout. So I'm not against higher turnout. I just don't think that higher turnout is necessarily and always a public good that is somehow wonderful. If someone as an informed citizen makes the decision, or that they're too busy or they're not interested enough to vote, that's fine. And as a political operative, as someone who's trying to win, my goal is to make sure people vote for me and not for my opponent. And a second place on that, that's the number one goal, will be persuading, an NDP voter to vote for us. But if we can't achieve that, a second place is that NDP voter doesn't bother to vote. And that's okay with me, because it's about, it's about getting the more votes than the other guy. That's the nature of the game.
I think it's not accurate to assume that people that are saying none of the above appeal to me, I'm comfortable. I think they're saying I'm uncomfortable. I'm not happy with the way things are going, and that's why I'm opting out of voting. And I think that's a bad thing for the country.
Mm-hmm. I also think we live in a democracy, something that most of us consider a privilege.
Absolutely.
And I think that there's ignorance in assuming that people, with all due respect, that people aren't voting because they're sitting something out. There's a huge issue of people actually not being reached or not being engaged in order to vote, right? And many of those people tend to be marginalized, tend to be people who don't have the same access or the same ability to go vote. And I think it's incumbent on us as people who are engaged in politics to ensure that they do come out and vote, irrespective of your political party. Of course, on E-Day, if you're running an E-Day for the NDP, do I want every Liberal to sit home? Yeah, I understand what you're saying, right?
But if we accept that it's a good thing for all people to vote in a democracy, it's engagement, it means people are listening and caring. How can we use advertising, Mira, to make citizens more engaged and to get them to the polls?
That's a good point. I mean, there's always the question of how positive and negative ads play into the role of a campaign, which I think is a legitimate and fair question. I think advertisement, to some degree, what Bob is saying, ads play a role in the sense that they educate, right? They raise awareness that there's actually an election coming up, which a lot of people don't know, may not know about. So I think they play that role, positive or negative. But I don't think they're the means. I don't think they're the end game, right? They're a piece of the puzzle in terms of engagement. They're a small piece. I think political parties that are successful go way beyond that in terms of engagement. They, first of all, being out there defining issues is probably one of the best ways to get attention and to raise awareness. And being out on the doorstep and out in your community and actually having people talk to people, there's no more effective way to engage people in a political process.
Absolutely. But it's an interesting point on turnout. The European elections were held in most countries in the European Parliament today, and turnout was up in France, which is the first time it's ever gone up in the history of the European Parliament. And the reason it's gone up is a reason that everybody in the political class and a lot of people are really appalled at, which is the rise of the National Front, which is a anti-immigrant, very populist party. They've shed most of their fascist background, thank heaven, but they're still not perhaps the most nicest people in the world. But the fact of the matter is that turnout's up because those are elections that have historically been seen as something that doesn't matter in people's lives. And the National Front, rightly or wrongly, said this is an opportunity to vote against the entire political class, all these people in Paris and Brussels who are wasting your time and money. And they made it about something that matters. And if you want turnout to go up, you have to give people a reason to vote. And I think the general decline in turnout is being around the fact that most people don't think it matters who you vote for. And it's a function of the media, it's a function of all the political parties, and it's a function of the fact that, and I believe this more and more strongly, that we are most of the big issues have been settled in our society. We're debating whether taxes are going to be 10% higher or 10% lower. We're debating whether we're going to be...
What about climate change?
I would say that, judging by the federal government's performance, or even if you're in the provincial government here in BC, if you're in climate change, you've got the Green Party, who are strong on this, the NDP, who talks nothing about climate change, and then you've got the BC Liberals who brought in a carbon tax. The fact of the matter is that we're arguing over relatively small, differences, and we all get excited, and it all seems really, really important. But if we're arguing about the question of whether our economy is going to be like Greece's or it's going to be like, Michigan's, is not the same debate as whether we're arguing like we're going to be like Cameroon or Denmark. That's a big differences.
Personally, I think the way to get people to the polls is what the some of these parties in Europe have done, is make people angry, make them emotional. And in my experience covering campaigns, that's what really got people out to vote. Sorry?
No, underlying most of this is emotion, right? Values are deeply connected to emotions, and if we don't play on them, then we're unlikely to reach people.
Okay, let's go into the lab, and I want you to tell me, Bob, take me through the process of creating a political brand.
Well, part of it is trying to find out where people are at, what their mindset is, and that involves voter research and starts with polling, and you have focus groups with voters, you connect with them through other means, and you try and find out where they're at and how their current mindset defines their values today, and where those values align with the values that you're trying to espouse in an election.
The focus groups, would they, like under Mulroney, would they have been focus groups that were all conservatives, or you get all?
No, you want to hear from all voters, and then if you're testing out issues that are going to appeal to your core group of voters, then you do focus groups with those types of voters. If there are issues where you're attacking someone else's position, you want to hear from all voters and see how the voters respond to that potential attack.
Okay, then what?
And then you start developing your messaging, and you look at who's best to deliver that message. Is that a message that the leader, as the way that they're defined today, can deliver that message, or is it someone else that can deliver that message? How is that message going to be delivered? Is it traditional advertising? Are we going to be using social media today? Who are the validators of that message? Who can we have come in and say that we agree with that message resonates with us, or that message is important to our livelihood?
So you would actually go out and call the interest groups and get them to make statements saying,
absolutely,
reinforcing.
And you look for candidates within your own party that have some personal attachment to that issue and that have some experience with it, and they can be the champion of the issue. It's much like branding a product.
Back to Smarties. How, Hamish, do you use the different mediums to manage the personality of the politician, the brand? For example, television versus radio versus print. How do you decide what to deploy in order to create the brand you want?
Well, I mean, I think these days you have to use them all because we're in a much more split environment, and you have to, I think, come up with distinct messages based on your different mediums and understanding who the audience who responds to the mediums are. So, for instance, Globe and Mail readers in Toronto are one group of people. Globe and Mail readers here are different people. People who read the province are different from the Globe and Mail. You have to really understand who those people are that consume news. Because the biggest thing that's happened is that, and we've done research on this, only about 50% of Canadians consume news on a very regular basis. And I realize that in the newspaper industry is not something wild to hear about, but it's people are not, and that's all news. That's not capital P political news. That's whether they're reading, about what's happening with Kim Kardashian's wedding, right? I mean, that's news. Most people are not paying attention in a very strong way. And then when it comes to social media as well, it's understanding the audiences. So, for instance, Twitter is a certain type of person is on Twitter. And that's very different from the average voter. And different people use Twitter for different ways. And Facebook is, again, very, very, very different demographic as well. So how you communicate and what you create and the content you push out is going to vary depending on your method. And what you want to do is you have everything going back and reinforcing the same message. So if your message is, my leader is really strong on the economy, everything is going to go back to that macro message, but you might have micro messages that build that overall theme. They're tailored for individual groups within each individual medium.
And just to add to that, I would say you go where your candidate, you have to go everywhere, but you also go where your candidate's strongest.
Yeah.
right? So
For
if you're-
example?
well, for example, there's a reason that Trudeau's picture is everywhere, and he's not on the radio. He looks good. He has good hair. He likes the way he looks, right? Like that's part of their brand. And so if I were running his campaign, I would not suggest that he be only on Twitter, on the radio. I would probably do what they're doing, right? Put his face as much as you can everywhere. He likes to be in the public. Versus like Stephen Harper, who's stiffer and maybe less approachable to voters. So you can, you may present him through a different medium to play up a candidate's strengths.
So what would be a medium that would favor Stephen Harper?
You tell me.
A vest. That's what he did last night.
Well,
last time, a sweater vest.
Yeah.
A sweater vest.
Or the army, like
But we do a lot of regional TV, regional newscasts, and in fact, in the I can't remember when it was, between 06 and 08, we developed an entire strategy around getting him on the regional news, because it's a different type of people who watch the 6 o'clock or the 5:30 news in Vancouver or Regina than who watch the national news at 10 or 11. So, and that was a group that we needed to connect with. So we built a whole strategy around regional news. And if you remember, there was ads in the 05, in the early part of 05 going into 06. There was ads with him. They were kind of hokey, and he was doing this sort of mock interview with this a female interviewer who was probably in her early 30s, and it was sort of around this slightly crappy TV set. And the goal was to basically mimic production values of regional news, and to give people the idea that like they were seeing an ad that mimicked how they were used to getting information. And these ads were universally panned by the national media, because we weren't running them at 10 o'clock on the CBC or CTV. We were running them at 5:30 in St. John's, right? And people and his numbers, his trust numbers, when those started running way up. And before Christmas, he was trailing the party, and after Christmas, he was, because we knew who our voters were, and we knew what medium they had communicated on, and we went after them.
Okay. No wonder they pay you guys so much. You're surprised by that?
No, I'm saying that you don't ever want to be surprised by who your like. The whole idea is to know your audience so well that you know that regional news is where Stephen Harper voters are.
Okay, Bob, I want to know what is your opinion of third-party ads? Can these be more effective than the internal branding?
Well, they're validators. First of all, if they're positive ads, they're validating your message. I'm trying to think about third-party advertising that's been damaging to a party, and I can't think of a third-party campaign that's been fairly persuasive in defining a candidate negatively.
I can think of one.
Okay.
The Swift Boats for Truth in 2004, when the Swift Boat thing just destroyed a huge dent in John Kerry's campaign. It was brutally effective.
You see a lot of them in the States.
Yeah, better in the States.
We haven't seen third-party advertising in Canada as strong as we have in other places.
Yeah.
Well, in Ontario, the Working Families Coalition in the last election did a real number on, which is the unions, created this group called the Working Families Coalition, and they ran a lot of ads against Tim Hudak, which apparently were one of the reasons he lost in the last couple of days, although they haven't really gone all in this election, which is interesting.
I think third-party ads can be incredibly effective. You see them here more with through labor or business, and they have played some role, often pre-election in shaping public opinion before the writ is dropped. But I did a lot of third-party ads in the last presidential election. I found that there is a lot more space to offer a different message that a political party can't necessarily put out because it's too risky for them. So it enables a slightly harder hitting narrative potentially to be out there that you would never want your leader to be using. And I think that's where you see third-party ads really making an impact.
This wasn't advertising, but it was just recently the spokesman for Labour in British Columbia have said some really nice things about Christy Clark. And that seemed to be very effective.
In what sense?
Well, they were saying that she's great to work with and she's really made an effort. And I think that really helped her brand because it was a group that normally would talk up the NDP.
That may be true, but I think if that was done, then the strategy for it was to actually help Labour themselves, right? Because what they're seeking is to get something from her. So there's no better way than to compliment someone. And
Okay. Okay, on the one-year anniversary of Christy Clark and the BC Liberals' re-election, a recent poll, it was by Insights West, suggested that opinions of our Premier have worsened over the last 6 months. What role can rebranding play to change the conversation? Can you effectively rebrand?
I think you can with a opposition leader. I think it's extremely difficult with a prime minister or premier. Once you get to, if you're prime minister, about 90% of Canadians have an opinion on you, give or take. If you're a premier, about 80% do, which means that realistically there's 20% of people in this province who don't really know who Christy Clark is. And that is very difficult to overcome because they've got that adjective in their head, and a nuclear bomb's not going to dislodge it. Opposition leaders can be rebranded because even if they've run and lost in an election, they can often come back. And a great example of this was in the 2005-6 campaign when Harper won. 2004, Liberals did a very effective job of branding him as extreme, out of touch, and all sorts of things. And his poll numbers dropped off in the last 7 or 8 days, and it was quite effective. Going into the 06 election, the Liberals basically thought, well, the job's already done. People already think that about him. We don't have to rebrand him. And that was a long campaign because the way that it fell over Christmas. So the campaign started about December 1st and went till January 23rd. And the Liberals didn't run any negative advertising until about New Year's. And that gave Harper, with his positive advertising and the campaigning and some of the issues and what he was pushing, the chance to brand himself. And his personal numbers moved significantly in that month, at which point the Liberals didn't have by the time they deployed all their ads, it was in some ways too late. And I remember going through this in 08 when we were beating Dion, and my boss came to me and said, maybe we should let off on some of these negative ads branding Dion as the campaign starting. Everybody knows he's not a leader. And I said, no, we've got our foot on his neck. Let's keep pushing. Let's do it. We absolutely have to remind people, because if people forget, and we can spend millions of dollars 6 months before a campaign, but they forget about an opposition leader because it's not somebody who's part of their brain space.
Mira, do you think there was any way that Adrian Dix could have been rebranded after the last election provincially?
No, I don't. After the last election, could he have been rebranded?
Yeah.
Not effectively. I think the loss was too catastrophic. I don't think he had the party. I think if you're going to try and rebrand within as a leader, you would really have to have your party's support and your caucus support to do that. And I don't think that was there, given the scale of the loss. I do think that, you've seen some attempts to rebrand someone who's in power. I think Gordon Campbell attempted to rebrand himself on a number of occasions, for better or worse. And in some cases, I think he was effective at that. So I think you can tinker with a rebrand once you're already in power, but it's...
A lot of it depends on how strongly you've defined your brand. I think a year from now, if we don't see an LNG plant under construction, Christy Clark strategists are going to desperately be trying to rebrand her. She's invested so much in that.
Wasn't that dangerous, though? Couldn't they have foreseen this?
They were trying to win. They were going to say anything to win.
I'm glad you said it.
I'm not a liberal, so that's...
But she's continued to pound away at this since the election as well. The Tyee has noted that the word LNG has been mentioned in 86 government news releases since Clark and her cabinet were sworn in last summer.
Because she might not have another strong place to go to, right? Yeah. So if they're showing any strength in her numbers and her polling numbers, it's clearly there, and it's a huge gamble. I think it's huge risk.
I think the more she realizes from her trips to Asia that this opportunity is slipping away, the more she's desperately trying to reinforce it here at home.
But
she needs to sell Smarties, and that's what she's trying to do.
But how long can you keep selling LNG with no LNG?
Well,
we haven't sold a cubic meter of it yet.
But to be fair, in the last election, she sold fiscal responsibility when in 3 years she'd grown BC's debt by 50%, and she spent the whole time saying about debt-free BC. It's just an outright bold-faced lie. The good news for her was she was running against a party and a leader that had less economic credibility than she did. And
Or who didn't hold her to account on
and
it.
didn't hold, well, but even if they did, if the NDP was the one pounding away on debt, it's just, again, more of a stretch, right? It's easier if the NDP is pounding away on healthcare, their brand, okay, people believe, yeah, the NDP, nurses, healthcare, I believe them on that. That sounds about right. But on debt, there's an inherent skepticism, right?
Now, we touched on this a little before, but I want to ask you broadly, is this political branding business really, if you weren't political strategists, would you think that it's really the right thing to do, creating these political brands, when really, let's face it, we should be educating voters about the election issues and directing our attention to ways to increase voter turnout? Should we really be spending all this time and money on political branding?
I think yes. I think it's easy to see political branding as like going to get a manicure, but I don't actually think that's what it is, right? I think that if a political brand is effective, it's much deeper than that. And I think it is about how a party presents itself and how it attracts people to it. I think, we're talking about the last provincial. I think one of the core things that deciphered the two parties or distinguished the two parties from each other was that one brand was of confidence and the other was of insecurity. And I think that's at the core of a political brand. It is how you are seeking to attract voters. And in that sense, I think it's as much about voter engagement as it is about a nice font, both of which I think matter. And I think people play down far too much the power of a strong brand within politics. I think it's critical.
I think it's about attracting support, and if you want to affect change on the issues that are important to you, you have to have support to be able to do that. I think we could move away from adjectives and move more towards the issues, though, and try and go a little deeper and connect with what's really bothering people today or what's really motivating people today, and I think we're failing to do that. I think I'm the oldest one here, and I've been involved in politics probably the longest, and I got involved as a young person. I got involved, and I have had to keep reminding myself of that as I've spent more time on the fringes of politics, what really motivated me to get involved in the first place, and it was about issues. It wasn't about the game of getting elected or about power or anything like that. It was issues, and I got caught up in much of that search, that seeking power and the game that's played around that. But we forget it's really about the people that we identify with and the issues that we share with them, and how we see a better future if we are able to advance those issues. And I think politics today has moved away from that. And I think part of it is our system of government as well. And we haven't looked at how can we reform our system of government to align with the changes in technology, the changes in values that people have had today. We gave an opportunity in British Columbia twice to voters to try and choose another electoral system, a system that's more based on proportional representation, and they rejected that. And I think a lot had to do with the brands that were connected with those campaigns, and they didn't motivate people to look at what that
But
really
there were
meant.
campaigns elsewhere in Canada, they failed too.
Right, and I don't think we've spent enough time trying to connect with people and show them, connect the dots to their own lives and how their voice can be heard more effectively if we had different systems. And we think about democracy, this institution that's very old, and we cherish it, but we don't think about the tactical and technical sides of democracy and how it can actually work for our lives today.
Before we wrap up, I want to ask you, just give us a sneak peek, Bob, of what you think Gregor Robertson is going to pitch as his brand, and what he's going to be trying to convince us he's been. I think it's been 8 years now, in preparation for the November vote. What are you expecting to see?
My sense is it's going to be around housing affordability and affordability of living in Vancouver. And
But wouldn't he lose on that basis?
No, I don't think so. I think he's going to show the progress that he's made. I think people realize how the city has changed over the last decade or more, and that he's actually done some things to try and slow that change, even though development, and you've written about it, even though a lot of people look at development projects as threatening to them. I think he can focus on messages that are apart from that relate to how we all have to protect our quality of life, and quality of life is about the cost of living in this city, and I think that's what he's going to focus on.
Hamish, what would you try and brand him as?
Well, if he's smart, that's exactly what he should do. That is absolutely the number one issue in this city. People hear housing affordability and they think it's about, things on the downtown east side for the destitute. But it's really about young families being able to buy in the city, being able to stay in the city. And if he can show something on that, I think he'll absolutely be reelected. I mean, he's aided in the fact that nobody's running against him with any credibility.
Yet.
Well, no, but with each passing day, that comes harder. It's the end of May. The election's November. Somebody can't expect to launch a campaign in September and suddenly come out of nowhere against the machine and the brand that he's built up. So, I at this point, I don't really think he's beatable. But if he's smart, he would do that. I think he'll probably just stick with his sort of greenest city kind of thing and keep that going, because that's his core brand that he needs to get his core people out. The core people who vote for him are very, very motivated on that, and that will probably be enough, because I don't think anybody else is going to come together in a meaningful way. I mean, someone will run, but it will be too little, too late.
Mira, do you have anything to add?
I just think that it's important to note that he has a brand and that people know what it is, and he's been very deliberate about that, and so has Vision Vancouver, and it's been about more than just a slogan or an adjective. It's actually, like you named, housing, you named greenest city. People know what the brand represents, and I think that's you could call that a successful brand.
It's the kind of thing that attracted me because it was about issues that connected with values, and we haven't seen that a lot in civic affairs in Vancouver, and that's what he's done, is he's taken some values and he said, here's the issues that will start to align with those values, and he's focused on those.
Okay. Now, we're going to turn it over to the audience. We've got the microphone there. So we have David E.B., and fire away.
Hi, thanks very much. Thanks very much for the discussion. It was fascinating, and I found it personally compelling, having been through the last provincial election, especially the discussion about the dark arts, and I found myself agreeing with Hamish, and then I found myself agreeing with Mira and Bob. And the challenge is that we just came through an election, and Adrian Dick set forth a mantra for candidates like myself, which was that we were going to run a positive campaign. And they were going to run all kinds of negative stuff, but we were going to stay positive. And at the time, throughout the election right up until E-Day, I said, that is the greatest thing that has ever happened. And what a wonderful idea, and how could this possibly go wrong? Politics is in some ways experience. So I guess my question is, having come through the election, and one experience sticks out in my mind, which was in hindsight, right? It's all in hindsight. Is a neighbor of mine, a teacher, friend's a bus driver, this is, we live in a relatively affordable building in Kitsilano. This is the heart of my support. Came up to me and she was angry. She was viscerally angry, and she said, I can't believe that man didn't pay his bus fare. And I said, what are you talking about? She's like, he didn't pay, I pay bus fare. Why didn't he pay bus fare? And she's like, I really like you, but you know what, I'm probably going to vote for you. But she couldn't, she's my next door neighbor, and she's friendly, and that was how effective those Concerned Citizen for Christy Clark ads were, the negative ads. And my question with all of that prelude is simply, can we ever run an election without the sort of Stéphane Dion, Justin Trudeau, Concerned Citizen kind of campaign and win an election? Is that possible to run the campaign that Adrian wanted to win? Was he just the wrong candidate? Did he not tell his story well enough? He
refused to get negative.
Yeah. Are we just unwilling to do the dirty work that is essential to win a political campaign, or
Okay.
is it possible to live in that world?
Bob, you take that one.
I'm the wrong person to ask because up until the last election, I never voted NDP in my life. And I voted NDP in the last election, and I did it because of that message. And it resonated with me, but it didn't resonate with anyone else. I think it was a courageous message. I think it's a message that Well, I'm hoping it's a message more active politicians will embrace and try and make part of that adjective that they define, but it wasn't successful.
I think there's a difference between being positive and not hammering your opponent. I really do. I think that or not at least holding your opponent to account. And I think that, to me, that was the difference in the last campaign that Dix could have done differently. I too was attracted on some level to the, being positive or being above board, but you can't be above board and not hold your opponent to account like that and win. That, to me, is not an equation that adds up.
Yeah, I mean, elections, as I said right at the very beginning, elections is a decision someone makes once, and they're not going to make again for that level of government for 3 or 4 years. You can't buy Smarties and decide you don't like Smarties, and then you go back to buying Mars bars next week. So if you're helping people make a choice, and it's a binary choice, it's I'm voting for this person, or I'm not voting, or I'm voting for this person or this person. It's a choice between these two people. If you're in a sort of broadly two-party system, if you're making that binary choice, you need to be able to say, here's the reasons why you should vote for me, the good stuff I'm going to do, and you have to remind them of the reasons why the other people are failing. If you're a government, you have to say, these guys are going to get in and they're going to mess stuff up, and if you're in opposition, you have to say, remember why you didn't like these guys, because people aren't spending a huge amount of time thinking about this. And look, what I dislike is the negative ads you see in the States that are very much entirely character-driven, that are these...
You made those.
No. The difference... No. The difference that what we did is we simply showed quotes of their own words. It was Stéphane Dion saying, it's difficult to make priorities, It's not... that says more than anything else. If I'd gone and said that, if it had been Stephen Harper saying... this in an ad, it wouldn't have been credible. The fact of the matter is that it showed that he was not a leader and he was not able to lead, and the subsequent events bore that out. What I think, running an ad about someone's extramarital affairs or something like that, something that we've mercifully been spared in this country, and I hope we will be, is I think we should avoid. But I think you should always be able to give that contrast. We did X, these guys did Y, and that was bad. And sometimes that's going to be a bit sharp and pointy if you want to get through this incredibly busy media environment to get through people's lives. And that's why the Dix ticket thing worked, because that was something that actually matters, that hundreds of thousands of people take the transit system every day in this city, and they get what that means not to pay it. It cuts through talking about that was, I think, much more effective than the memo when he was chief of staff and all that. Nobody understood what that backdating memo was, a bunch of government gobbledygook. But not paying for a transit ticket, everybody knows what that means.
Mm-hmm. Yes. We have a microphone heading our way. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm trying to turn this into a question. But what I'm thinking, so I'll try.
Because we're only doing questions. We're not doing mini speeches.
This isn't a speech. It's just I've been listening, and I have to agree that I think both the issues are important to present to the voters, and I think branding is really important. And I guess my question would be, is it possible to balance the two? Because I know... yes, we can in the States. That was incredibly powerful, I thought, with Obama. And also, the last election, federal election, I was looking for somewhere, I want to be an educated voter, and what are the issues for each party. So is there a way to balance both of them? Because I think they're both really important.
I'll go briefly. I agree 100%. I think you can, how parties choose to present issues, they can do that within the rubric of their brand. The best example was a by-election in 2006 where the federal Conservatives had just brought in the universal child care benefit, the $100 a month for kids under 6. And we found in the by-election people coming up and saying, I don't like Harper, but I've got 3 kids under 6. He's actually delivered something for me. He's not the sort of person I would normally vote for. And there was an issue, and we branded that with, here's a guy who delivers results. So his brand was delivering results, and here was a very tangible result in an issue that he had delivered and then other parties had voted against.
Because they were seeking national child care plan. But I think that I think a brand should be infused with issues. I think we've touched on this a little bit. And in the case of Yes, We Can, it I think spoke to a particular moment in history that was about something deeper, and that's why in some ways it worked, it connected. And I think that, like, to some degree you were saying that most of the problems in this democracy or in this country have been solved. I think that's part of the conservative brand, because it plays to your base and it keeps people home by not igniting people around the issues that they actually need to fight for. And I think that it's important that parties that are working against the conservatives are very aware of that and heighten the definition of the issues that matter most.
Interesting point. Yes.
I said 2 quick comments. One was, Hamish, I'm like super impressed. I think whether you agree with who he's representing or not, man, I think you're just bang on. And I'm kind of a political Luddite, so I don't know a lot. And the second point that I've always wanted to make with the NDP super quick is, like, for me with the last election, I was super upset. And I've always wanted to say this because, like, you had 2 politicians running who, in my opinion, were damaged goods. And the guy that I wanted to vote for as a leader of the province, I wasn't allowed to.
Sorry, which person?
Evie. And so for me, like, it was super frustrating as a person who's never voted NDP. I was like, the NDP wouldn't give me the person that I felt should lead the province. They brought in someone who was damaged against somebody who was damaged, so you kind of went with the lesser of 2 evils, just as a branding thing. So those are my 2 points.
I didn't know David was a leadership candidate at the time.
Okay, we're going for questions. So if anybody has a question.
We were living in Calgary a couple of years ago when Nenshi got elected, and a lot of people kind of attribute his success to social media, but I think it was much more about how he tackled the issues and explained everything way more than anyone else. Do you think modern federal parties kind of underestimate people's intelligence when branding and maybe don't consider that people can latch on to smart ideas?
I worked on Rick McIver's campaign, who ran against Nenshi beat, and I challenge most Nenshi voters today to name one thing he actually ran on. His slogan was "Better Ideas for Better Calgary," which is a great slogan. I mean, who's against better ideas? It's great. And better Calgary. If you live in Calgary, that's fantastic. But when you actually look at specifics of what he promised, are very, very vague in most cases. He couched it in smarter language for sure. But Nenshi won for one reason. He was different, and everything he did about his campaign was different, and that was very smart. The purple signs, which people didn't hear, but it was purple signs everywhere. It was very obviously different. He was obviously an academic. He is not white, which is fairly novel for a politician in Calgary. And everything he did was very, very different. And that election became about who was best represented change. And the guy I was working for, Rick McIver, was a longtime councillor who'd been the #1 opponent of the mayor. He ran the campaign that he should have run against the guy who'd been mayor, which he would have won, because if people didn't like the way things had been going previously. But my guy, who'd been the #1 critic of the way things were going previously, because he'd been in council for, I think, 9 years, was simply seen as, well, he's part of the old system. And everything about Nenshi was new and different, and people just voted for different. And the mistake going back to David's question about contrast, the mistake that my candidate did was they never talked about the consequences of a Nenshi win. He didn't go to his own voters and the homeowners in South Calgary and say, here's what will happen if Nenshi wins. He doesn't have a plan for this. Your taxes are going to go up and all these other terrible things. And he never did that. And I remember sitting the day after the election at the Calgary airport, and there was a bunch of oil guys sitting beside me saying, well, who'd you vote for? And these guys were South Calgary. They probably make $200,000 a year. Every one of them votes federally conservative. They're Wild Rose voters provincially. These are not, but we both said, oh, yeah, we voted for Nenshi. And one of them guys said, well, why'd you vote for him? He says, well, my son liked his name, so I said I'd vote for him. And the other guy said, I was driving in to vote, and Nenshi's was the last radio commercial I heard. So I said, what the hell? And for me, that was something that my candidate had failed to persuade them that there was consequences to this election. They didn't feel that it mattered who won enough, so they said, I'm going to vote for the guy who's different because I kind of want to change. So they did, and Nenshi won. But if they'd been able to say, here's how different is bad or scary, which is what Alison Redford did to the Wild Rose last year or 2 years ago, it could have been done. But I think that Nenshi is actually the perfect example of that dumbed down, very, very simplified message.
Just quickly, I think you're right on so much about Nenshi running on being different, and that just like the Yes We Can, it spoke both because of who he was. But I also think he does have a very smart political skill, which is to speak to people like they are smart. And that's sort of, the Clintons do that also. They speak to people like they're smart, and it makes you feel good. Mm-hmm. And it makes you feel like I understand that, because they explain complicated things, not in dumbed down language, but in sophisticated language that lifts up the political discourse instead of bringing it down. And I think people are attracted to that.
And that's the antithesis of the negative campaign. He's appealing to people that want to be treated intelligently. And I think Calgarians wanted their city to be treated that way. They saw themselves as a success story, but they were often viewed outside of Calgary as this sort of redneck place, and they wanted to be something different.
Yeah. Yes. Okay.
Hi there. Most of the discussion has focused on the party level, the big picture, and I wonder if you have thoughts on branding candidates at the riding level, nomination campaigns. Obviously, in elections, we're told that local campaigns can only make sort of 5% difference than how the wave might affect the riding given demographics of the riding. But there's obviously ridings where the local candidates make a huge difference if they have a clear brand, and obviously David somehow managed to convince his neighbors, despite the bus issue, to vote for his brand. So how does that work? How's it changing? Is technology and social media more relevant, less relevant at the local level? And why don't we hear more analysis in the media of that level of politics? It's always leaders versus leaders, which is kind of boring, I think, to a lot of us.
I think the national campaigns in federal elections have dominated today. I don't think local campaigns really have a role. In fact, in 2004, I co-chaired the Conservative campaign in British Columbia, and when I was asked to do so by Stephen Harper, I asked him, how much authority am I going to have to make regional decisions over the campaign strategy, and he said, absolutely none. I was shocked by the answer, but I was also pleasantly surprised that he was so decisive about it when he told me that. And it turned out to be true. I mean, the campaign was directed centrally, and none of the candidates had any ability to deviate from the central message. And I think that's probably true of all of the parties today at the national level. Yeah,
I mean, in the 2008 campaign, we had regional co-chairs ready to announce, but we didn't. We said, well, wait till somebody actually, a media member of the media asks to know who they are, and they never did, so we never announced them. No, we had them. We just never announced them. We're just ready to go. But I think my adjective idea that you can have one adjective is even more true of local candidates. And I think a local candidate, I mean, their amount of mind share that they can get is even less because they don't have the advertising and everything else. But they can get an adjective. I worked with a candidate in the federal election in 2011 where all we wanted was for people to know her as hardworking. So everything she did, I mean, she did all the party branding, but anything she did locally, she did win. And
her name?
And the well, I'm not going to disclose that moment, but the media, the media started describing her as hardworking. Everything, her whole Twitter feed was simply about hardworking. So it was, he just came back from door knocking, putting in signs. Here's a picture of me with my campaign crew. It was everything about hardworking and not about anything else, because we wanted people to know she was working really, really, really hard, and that was the core thing that one thing people should know about her.
I actually think you raise a good point, and I'm glad you raised it about local candidates, because I think this may be part of a shift we're seeing in politics, that people actually want to have a sense of who their candidates are. And I know when I worked with Gregor Robertson in his 08 campaign provincially, when he was that 08? 05, when he was running with the NDP, many people voted for him because he was a New Democrat. Others voted for him because they liked him specifically and were attracted to who he was. And David, I think, saw some of that as well. And I think that a younger generation of voters is attracted to knowing who their candidate is and to connecting with them, and that can in some ways influence their vote. And I think that social media does play a role in that, because an individual candidate will become much more personable than they would just through mass marketing TV or radio. So I think there's something in that you've touched on. I'm not actually sure exactly where one goes with that, because it does get tricky. You want to keep a central message. But I won't be surprised if we see more individual candidates marketing themselves, you know.
Even in the GOTV efforts today, the Get Out the Vote efforts, those are centralized in national and provincial campaigns. So the local constituency really doesn't even have a role in connecting with those voters that they've identified as supporters.
We had, okay.
Thank you. I want to ask about what you think of voters, because what I'm hearing is a duality here, that voters have short-term interests. They can be bought off personally. They're detached. They only make a decision at the pretty much at the last minute, which is why polls show that they switch so quickly, and that you can and that they can succumb sometimes to an appeal to novelty, versus people who respond to vision, to deeply held values, to long-term interests. And I'm confused about, who are the voters?
Stan Greenberg, the American pollster, always said every voter has the right to contradict themselves. And I think that that there's so much truth in what you're saying. There is contradiction in a lot of what we're saying, and I think that's exactly to Greenberg's point. Voters contradict themselves, and to some degree, you have to be willing to have a little bit of both in order to reach them.
The question I always ask is, are you influenced by advertising? And everybody in this room is smart and well-educated and an independent thinker. And yet we all buy Crest or Colgate or whatever else that they're shilling on TV about something we don't pay that much attention to. So we're all influenced by advertising. So as much as we can be critical, deep thinkers at various points in our lives, we're not in others. So some people might be super engaged at the federal level and not really care about provincial and never vote municipally, or vice versa. People do their own thing. The other thing you got to realize is that the voters we're targeting is actually a very small subsection of the population. Of people who actually vote, which is again about half the people, give or take, about 50% of them are pretty much locked-in partisans who know who they're going to vote for today at any of the next elections. Generally, it varies, but overall, about half. And about another quarter make up their mind during the course of the campaign, and this number has been increasing in the last, say, 10 years. Now it's about a quarter. In some elections, it's a third. Make up their mind in the last 2 or 3 days. So when we're talking about the voters we're after, we're looking at a very small segment of the population. In many cases, the people who are making up their mind, the people who are the best informed, aren't making up their minds at the last minute. The people who spend a lot of time thinking about politics are much more likely to have firm views on politicians and parties and policies and what's happening in the news. I mean, I'm obsessed with politics, and I know who I'll vote for the longest period, which is the most right-wing party's got a chance of winning, except for the BC Liberals, who I can't stand. But the fact of the matter is that the people we all know probably going to vote for. I mean, you voting NDP is interesting, but that's. But it came from a long think about politics. And, so we're looking at a small group of people who aren't spending very much time thinking about politics, who are like, oh, crap, I got to go vote. Who am I going to vote for? And, they're thinking about the ads, that brand, who's the guy? Okay, there's the guy who's the bully, but he's a strong leader. There's the other guy who's got great hair, but he's an idiot. There's the angry dude with the beard. But, you all laugh because we're all educated and informed, but there's millions of Canadians making that decision 20 minutes before they vote based on exactly those things, right?
So while Hamish and Mira are working on that 50% that actually vote, I'd like to see some people focus on the other 50% that are staying at home and seeing if we can actually probe those people and go a little deeper and see if we can stir their interest around their values. I believe today, and I don't have any data to back this up, but that if you did some polling that really got down to people's values, there's a lot of discontent in their lives today. And that discontent is around big issues. It's not around the small issues that are decided in the course of a term of government. There are issues about income inequality. There are issues about their environment and whether you class that as climate change or their urban environment or whatever. It's about how hard they're working today and the least amount of free time that they have available, how they're using that free time today, the cost of things, and how it's a struggle to stay ahead of debt and so on. I think those are issues that have what I call this latent discontent. And I think if we can get to those issues in a meaningful way, we can motivate part of that other 50% that's sitting on the couch.
Okay, we have a question here.
2 more.
Okay.
Given that each of the parties represented here today are Canadian, pan-Canadian parties, is there a danger in one party using the brand of Canadian or nation? And the thing I'm thinking about is when Paul Martin kept talking about, we stand for Canadian values, which totally alienated me because I wasn't going to be voting Liberal, and I felt, oh, does that mean I don't have any Canadian values? And I was concerned when the lady, I'm sorry, I haven't
Mira?
heard your name, Mira, said when your opening statement that you're, if you were telling Tom Mulcair what his vision, what his brand should be, our country, I thought, oh, does that mean that if I don't agree or vote for him, I'm not in his country? Is there a danger in using that in a brand?
I'll just respond to that quickly. It's a fair point. I don't think that that you want to be so literal as to say, I can't remember what you said, Paul Martin's was about fighting for Canadian values. I think that's too literal. And a lot of brands, both in look and feel, are often far too literal. And I think that a good brand has a much more, connects with voters because it's not specific and not as literal as using the word values. However, fighting for our Canada, let's say, or fighting for your Canada, which may be better, right? Yours speaks to you versus our. I mean, I think there's something in there that engages national pride and patriotism, and I think that slogan may be a bigger problem because of Quebec than it is about your own values, right? And I think that's a separate conversation about which slogans work Canada-wide for that very reason, and less about for what you said around your values.
We had one final question.
Hi, thanks very much for your panel so far. It's been really interesting. I was just wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about why Rob Ford's brand has not been tarnished more. I'm very confused by that.
Great question.
Absolutely. Rob Ford has a remarkable brand. It's a dream to work with a politician who has that brand. His brand is the elites have been screwing you over for so long, and I'm not part of them. And he reinforces it. And he started his messaging ages ago about the elites are out to get me. They all hate me. The Toronto Star hates me. The Globe and Mail hates me. All the talking heads you see on TV, they hate me. I'm not one of your fancy downtown people. I don't want to be like that. And people love that, and they respond to it. And that's why Rob Ford, as a conservative populist politician, is the first one in the country to have really amazingly strong breakthrough in ethnocultural communities. It's unbelievable that the strength of that he's got through with people who are not or visible minority Canadians in Toronto, to have typically not been open to right-wing populist politicians, because he's said something which they get, which is the shiny towers downtown is not, and the people who work and live down there are not my people. I don't get them, and this is a guy who's speaks simply and makes it very clear what he stands for. And he's built because he was the first one to be very successful at that. People are willing to give him a chance, and the whole narrative about him, about everything that's gone on in the last year, has only, with certain segment of the population of his voter base, has only reinforced that here are the elites getting him. He always said at the beginning, the elites are going to do everything they can to get me out of the mayor's chair. So when it happened, the mechanism almost didn't matter, right? I think, though, the stuff in the last few weeks that's really come out has really done a number. If he'd stopped doing crack in the fall, everything in politics that I've seen and in polling that I've seen is that Canadians, and this goes true across the country, are a forgiving bunch. They'll give someone a chance, and they'll give someone who's screwed up a chance to fix it once. But if they see that trust has been abused, that, okay, you screwed up once, get it right. But now that you screwed up again, you're going to say, I think it's good. So If he comes out of rehab next week and says, hey, I'm cured, but he's still 350 pounds and, is drunk half the time, he's not going anywhere. If he comes out of rehab in September and he's lost 80 pounds and he's looking good and he said, look, I had a really, it was been a brutal 3 months, but I fixed my life, I'm not counting him out.
Okay, Bob, you're shaking your head.
Rob Ford is sick. He has an addiction illness, and 4 months is not going to cure his illness. I hope that he spends the time that he needs to recover properly. Part of recovery is not being in the heat of an election campaign and the stress around that. If he's successful in his residential treatment program, he needs aftercare probably for a year to a year and a half to fully recover, and I hope he does that.
Okay, I think that we've exhausted our time, and I really want to thank Bob and Hamish and Mira. They've been fabulous. And thank you all for joining us.
Hi, I'm Helen Walsh, the director of the Spur Festival. So please join me in also thanking Barbara Yaffe for doing such a fantastic job moderating this event.
Thank you.